Welcome to this lesson on the Airbus briefings. This lesson is fundamental to your training. It is an important lesson because Airbus has recently redesigned the briefing techniques and the elements for standardized briefings. And this is to ensure standardization across the Airbus flying network. Now, what's specifically important in the new briefing techniques here, as we're going to be discussing, is how they focus on identifying and mitigating threats and errors. Long briefings with a lot of elements is not ideal, nor is it acceptable to do briefings where we simply state briefing is standard. Briefings are there for a purpose. We will start with a few notes on how the briefing is done and what the purpose of the briefings are. When Airbus redesigned the briefing techniques a couple of years ago, they put a lot of emphasis now on three topics of the briefing itself. First and foremost, the briefing purpose is to manage risk. This is done through threat and error management. The second element is to identify any deviations from SOPs. If you have been familiar with the briefings from Airbus from previous layouts, you will now learn and understand how a lot of the items that we otherwise briefed has been moved to SOPs and are no longer part of the briefings. The idea behind the new briefing techniques is to create a shared mental model between the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring, which then will lead to increased situational awareness and overall increase in safety. The first element here, manage risk, is how we identify and mitigate threats and errors. We simply look for any potential threat and errors that might affect our daily routine, and we brief them as a crew. We only brief those items, which means briefings will be different from flight to flight. In the second element here, identify deviations from SOP, we talk about anything that is not daily routine. We do not, as we have previously, go through the FMTS setup, the chart layout, etc. We talk here only about deviations from daily routine, and we will list them out. PM will go first, and then the pilot flying. This will generate a shared mental model between PM and PF that after the briefing, both crew members are totally in the know of what the intentions are. We use this same layout for both the departure briefing and for the arrival briefing. Remember, briefings should complement the SOPs. They should not repeat them. Previous briefing techniques, if you have been familiar with these, list items that have to do with FMTS check, fuel check, etc. However, to shorten the briefings and to make only relevant parts of the briefing part of the briefing technique, a lot of these items have now been moved to the SOPs. You'll find this during the lesson on SOP. Briefings should never be routine. They are meant to break the routine. So, if you're in the habit, as many crews are, to simply state briefing is routine or takeoff standard, that is not a proper briefing and should be avoided at all times. A really good briefing requires out-of-the-box thinking. We are to list and discuss things that are not routine, so you have to think about what threats and errors can impact my flight today. We follow the same layout for both the departure and the arrival briefings. We start always with the plan. PM will start by talking about what is the planned intentions. Then the pilot flying will complement the plan from the pilot monitoring, talking about his or her plan to execute the intentions. Then the pilot monitoring will start with the threats. What does he or she see as the potential threats for this particular flight? And finally, the pilot flying will jump on to talk about the threats in his or her opinion. This is then done through identifying the threats and mitigating the threats and the errors. Now let's jump into the cockpit to see how a professional crew will do the briefing, and then we will take apart the elements and discuss them. Here is departure briefing example number 1.
Okay, I think we're ready. You're pilot monitoring, so go ahead with the brief.
Okay, so we are planning runway 04 right for departure with the Kennedy 5 SID. Initially climb to 5,000 feet with an MSA in our departure segment of 2,000 feet. And in terms of fuel, we have no extra.
Okay, that's great. As we taxi out, we need to think about the hotspot at Juliet, even though 4 left is closed by NOTAM. For 4 right, we talked about it in the briefing room. We've only got 19 meters of stop margin on the wet runway there. There's no engine out SID, so as you get airborne, it's going to be SOPs. So what do you see as the threats?
I feel a little bit tired from the previous long flight, and that's it.
Yeah, I'm the same. I see the threats the same. We're both a bit tired. It's the end of a long day. It's going to be even more stressing with the high amount of radio transmissions around New York. So for the mitigations of that, we need to be really vigilant with the radio calls. We need to listen out for our call sign, listen out for our clearances. Of course, in the event of failure, when I take the radios, that we need to remember to prioritize to fly, navigate, and communicate after that.
Yeah, fully agree.
Questions?
No, thank you.
Let's go.
We saw here in the example that it was the pilot monitoring who initiated the briefing, and this is standard now. The pilot monitoring started the briefing by talking about the planned intentions, here listing the takeoff runway, the cleared altitude, the minimum safe altitude, and extra fuel and time. The pilot flying then complemented this by talking about his intentions for the planned departure. He listed the hotspots, which are particular to the taxi route and takeoff runway, the stop margin available in case of a rejected takeoff, the engine out SID procedure if applicable, then the return or diversion procedure that might be applicable in case of an emergency right after takeoff, and any non-routine operation, again, that are applicable. This lists the planned intentions from the crew, and both pilots are now on the same page. The second element of the briefing will be the threat and error management. Here again, it's the pilot monitoring initiating the threats part of the briefing, talking about the threats that he or she sees as potential to this particular flight. We will in the upcoming slide talk about the potentials that can be discussed here, but remember, it's out of the box thinking, anything that is not part of SOPs. After the PM stating the threats, the pilot flying will then state his or her input to the threats, and together they will talk about the threat mitigation. The final part of the briefing is any miscellaneous items that might be particularly important to this particular departure, and this is always the layer to follow. Remember, PM initiates the briefing and pilot flying complements, both for the plan part, for the threat part, and for the mitigation. The elements that are given up here as part of the plan part are the fixed items that should be briefed, and you will see that these items will change every time, so no two briefings should be alike. There is no mentioning of abnormal or emergency procedures. The review of abnormal or emergency procedures should not be standard for departure briefing. They should be part of the crew's preparation for a flight, not the briefings. Length of briefings should always vary. They could be short, They can be long, but should never as a standard be either short or long. Remember, a long briefing is not necessarily a good briefing, and under no circumstances is it allowed or acceptable to simply say briefing standard. Elements to consider as part of the threats and miscellaneous part could be the level of fatigue felt by the crew members who have limited experience in the cockpit or are unfamiliar with the airport for which they're departing from, weather operations such as hot or cold weather operation that might require special attention to anti-icing procedures, etc., or flying and departing in high mountainous terrain. These are not all of the elements that can be included, but should be given consideration when giving your briefing. Let's jump into the arrival briefing and look at how it follows the same layout and the same element, more or less. The arrival briefing given by the crew when all has been set up for the arrival and the approach, again, is designed to minimize the time spent on the briefing. Therefore, all checks have already been done by the two crew members. The idea here is to limit the head down time as part of the briefing. We follow the same layout as we did before, with the planned intentions first, then the threats and the mitigation as part of the arrival and approach. Let's jump back in the cockpit and look at the professional crew performing their arrival briefing. This is the arrival briefing example number 1.
So we are shortly before top of descent.
Yeah.
You've checked everything. Are you ready for
Yes, I
briefing?
did. I'm ready. So the plan is, as I perceive it, that we're flying now inbound SAFSA, that we expect the SAFSA arrival.
Mm-hmm.
The minimum off-route altitude right now is 7,000 feet, and the MSA is 3,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing ILS approach, runway 27.
Right.
The minimum descent altitude is 540 feet. And the missed approach procedure is we fly straight ahead 2,500 feet, and then make a right turn direct 7 miles from the ILS DME, and we'll maintain 2,500 feet during the missed approach.
Mm-hmm.
We do not have any additional fuel for time being. That's
Okay.
my plan so far.
Fine, that's what I've set up, and I will fly the ILS runway 27, fully managed.
Okay.
And with configuration full
Okay.
landing. We know now we have wet runway.
Yeah.
And light bumpy crosswind conditions.
Yeah.
Do you see any further threats?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I see one threat that we have no additional fuel, and the weather is
Yeah.
close to the minimum.
Yeah.
So in case we don't see the runway at the minimum, we should take the decision to fly straight to the alternate aerodrome,
To the alternate, yeah, fine.
because we don't have much time to circle around and
Yeah.
then make a choice.
Yeah, that's true. So if weather is an issue at the minima, we divert to the alternate.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
And the second one would be, I'm quite unfamiliar with the aerodrome. I've never been there,
Yeah.
so
Okay, I
no
see.
experience.
Yeah, I flew there several times, so we have to be aware of the offset of the localizer. It's about 2 degrees offset to the
Okay.
runway, and we have to align to the runway center line, short on final.
Yeah.
And the runway then will have a slight downhill slope,
Okay.
so I will try to make a firm landing,
Okay.
no long
yeah.
flare,
Okay.
and as I mentioned, full reverse, all standard.
Okay. That's all the threats that I can foresee.
All right, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Just as it was with the departure briefing, it is the pilot monitoring who initiates the arrival briefing. The pilot monitoring will start by talking about the planned intentions. He or she will, as the gentleman did in the example here, start with the arrival procedure itself. If you've been cleared for a particular star, any constraints, and radar vectors, etc. He will also state the moral and or MSA, the approach which has been programmed and are intended with the landing runway, the minimum descent altitude or decision height as set into the system, the missed approach procedure, and any extra time and fuel available. The planned intentions will then be complemented by the pilot flying, stating the approach to be flown, the level of automation managed, selected, raw data, the configuration for the landing, as well as the conditions of the runway, dry, wet, and any crosswind that might be particular to the landing. This summarizes the planned intentions from the crew, and again are not standard. They will then, by the PM initiating the second part of the briefing, talk about the threats for the intended arrival and approach, and potentially go around procedure, and the pilot flying will complement. This is done through threats identifying and then threat mitigation. Any miscellaneous parts will be covered at the end, but should, just like the departure briefing, not include standard operating, normal, everyday routine items. This is the layout, identical to the layout we saw in the departure briefing, but with the elements right here particular to the arrival briefing. For arrival briefings, there are elements that should be considered by the crew, again, such as fatigue, crew members with limited experience flying into unfamiliar airports, high mountainous terrain, and the status of the aircraft as listed on the status page. If you have had any abnormal emergency procedures and have dealt with failures, the status page right here, and in worst cases, the summary of complex failures, will guide the crew as to the abnormal parts of the briefing that should be included. And that concludes the arrival and departure briefing, both the elements and the techniques. There's one last element I wanted to include in this particular presentation, and it's how we do briefings to the crew in case of an emergency. The emergency briefing that I want to discuss here is the N.I.T.S briefing given by the captain to the purser or senior cabin advisor in the cabin following an abnormal or emergency procedure. It is a simple layout designed to be straightforward in high stress situations. It summarizes the situation and the intended actions from the crew. It should be incorporated into the aeronautical decision-making process by the flight crew, which can, depending on your operation, either be FORDEC, DOTA, DECIDE model. Whichever one is used by your operation, this should be part of that decision-making process. And when I say it should be part of it, we do give the N.I.T.S briefing as part of the last part, when we have already identified what intentions we want to do, and we are then executing the intentions. However, always include the crew in the back in the situation as a whole. There may be information about the situation going on in the back that you're not familiar with, that you might need in order for you as the captain to form the best possible decision with the safest outcome. When we have made a decision and we would like to inform the crew, we will call the purser to the cockpit over the PA with the standard phrase, "Purser to cockpit, please." Once the purser enters the cockpit, you will announce clearly that you would like to give them a N.I.T.S briefing. N.I.T.S stands for nature, intentions, time, and special information. The person coming in to take the briefing will write the 4 items down. Remember, keep it simple. First, you will state the nature. You will say, this is a N.I.T.S briefing. The situation is we have X, and S. This is what has happened. Briefly, in a single or two sentences, what has happened. Remember, don't make anything technical here. That is not for the crew to know. Intentions. Here you state the intentions of the captain. This will tell the rest of the crew what to do, what checklists and procedures they should perform, and how they should prepare for the situation. We will then state the time available for them to prepare for the emergency landing, and this is the time to landing. Finally, any special information that might be applicable to the situation. Here you should always think about elements, piece of information that the crew might need in order for them to perform their duties better and to save lives. So, an example of a N.I.T.S briefing from a captain in case of, for example, an engine 2 fire could be as following. This is a N.I.T.S briefing. We have lost engine number 2 due to a fire. We're unable to put out the fire on engine number 2. Our intentions are to return back to our departure airport immediately. The time to landing is 7 minutes. Please prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. On the right side, we still have a fire on the engine. Please be prepared for an emergency evacuation on the runway, but wait for my command, as we're going to wait for fire services to put out the fire if we cannot do so in the air. Also be mindful, we might only be able to use the left side evacuation doors. Please repeat back the N.I.T.S briefing to me as you understand it. Thank you very much. Please go and inform your crew. The N.I.T.S briefing is there to give the crew the information they need to perform their duties to the best of their abilities. Always remember, standard phraseology and communication in a multi-crew environment is crucial. And with this lesson, I hope that you and your fellow crew members will stay safer in the air. This is the Airbus new briefing technique.